Hello, my name is Andy Jowenson, and today I want to tell you all about the significance of trade. You might be asking yourself, why trade? Well, I believe that trade is the most significant and influential aspect of human development. Everything in our world today is a direct result of the success and or failures of trade in our society. And to focus on this and to analyze it, I'm going to tell you about two specific trade networks that have existed and shaped our world that we experience. The unfortunate reality for history majors is that we learn all about these rulers, but we don't learn about the systems often enough that fueled them. Rulers get remembered, but trade rules the world. And so to understand the world, we need to understand trade. And so I want to talk about some of the early aspects of trade. So we're going to take a brief look at the 2.5 million year history of humanity. So 2.5 million years ago, the first proto-humans emerged out of Africa. They used stone tools, and trading for them was as simple as passing the meat to the person next to them, looking at their tool and saying, a sharp one cuts a tree or cuts the meat, and a blunt rock smashes other rocks or nuts. And that was the extent of trade. And so for over 2 million years, that was the interaction. These interactions would stay within a family unit as they traveled from place to place, living in the moment, living for their survival. When we see it start to grow and start to develop into more intricate processes, is when we have the advent of fire. When humanity starts to be able to master fire and it becomes part of their everyday life about 300,000 years ago, we start to see, just like campfires today, people sitting around them at the end of the day, exchanging stories, starting to build culture. And their knowledge goes beyond their family unit. Suddenly they're in these little tribes and they're sharing the knowledge that, oh yes, the tools do this and that one does this. But also they're sharing, oh yeah, there's deer over in that field. And there's elephant over there. And oh, there's a river back there that has a lot of fish. We can catch them there. And so they start trading information. And you start to see little tiny pockets of humanity where it's like, okay, they come in waves and they start to kind of migrate together. And there's a little more cohesion. And it's because of the information that they're trading. Now, of course, the gap, to the present day is much smaller than the gap to them, living in the Stone Age. But we jump ahead again, and in the year 12,000 BCE, agriculture bursts onto the scene. And suddenly we're no longer the nomads that are hunter-gatherers living, from day to day. Suddenly people are living in communities. The first little civilizations are forming around their food source. And for the first time ever, humanity is experiencing excess. And so the person with extra wheat is going to trade that wheat to someone who has extra fish, because it makes more sense to do that if they focus on one thing. And so they start to become reliant on these little trade networks, because if one piece of the domino falls, everything crumbles and suddenly their world is falling apart. So they have to take more care. They have to develop systems to make trade possible and to make sure that it's profitable and good for society. And so we start to see civilizations and villages develop into the first empires. And if we keep flashing forward, through empire, through all the ages, we get to about 50 years ago when the internet bursts onto the scene, and suddenly trade goes beyond the physical world and it goes to a technological one, and suddenly over the internet we can trade everything: goods, services, social interaction, money. We're so interconnected and interwoven. And when we look at this timetable, we can see that we've always been that way. It's just become increasingly more intricate and increasingly more immersive for humanity. And that interwovenness is especially evident when we consider our first trade network that I want to talk about, which is the Silk Road. A lot of us learn about the Silk Road from Marco Polo, that he traveled from Europe to Asia, saw a lot of cool things, saw that all the riches of that world. But we also were taught that, it was just one road and everyone traveled along it, but that's not right. The Silk Road was not one singular road. It was a network of thousands upon thousands of intricate and small trade networks that would take from short place to short place, but they would connect and they would span thousands of miles. At its height, the Silk Road saw gold from Mali traveling all the way overland through to China and then on boats to Japan. Likewise, the silks from Japan and China and Korea would make their way by other routes back into Europe and Africa. And then new technologies and luxury started developing because they realized, oh, well, we can get more silk if we do this. So Venetian glass becomes the next commodity that everyone is all about. And spices, which it could have been called the Spice Road, are the mainstay. They fueled wars. They fueled the new nations being formed. The access to spices colored the world differently. It made it smell, look, and taste better. And Rome grew because of that desire for it, because of the trade they were able to secure with India. They didn't grow because they were just good fighters. They grew because they were able to get access to these goods. And when you look at society and civilization throughout history, the most successful civilizations were the ones that can control trade. The Genghis Khan was not just a great horseman. He knew how to dictate and control trade routes. And that's a consistent thing that we've seen throughout the Silk Road's history and throughout human history. But the other side of the pendulum with trade, because there's always a swing, there's a good side and a downside. The bad side was that merchants of goods became unfortunate merchants of death because the bubonic plague, the Black Death, swept across the trade routes at lightning speed because of its the trade route's own success. Suddenly, diseases could travel thousands of miles, literally 12,000 miles across. Half the circumference of the Earth could be spanned in the matter of a year or so by these goods. And so rats and fleas started moving, and suddenly diseases wouldn't die out in small pockets. They would spread and stagnate whole civilizations. A third of Europe died as a result of the Black Death, which only thrived because it was traded, as an indirect commodity in some ways. And so we see that dark side of trade, the dark side of the connections that we have. But as with anything, especially with trade, there's the pendulum swing again, and then we can consider that it was more than just trinkets. It was more than just illness that was exchanged along those routes. Ideas were exchanged. Religions were exchanged. Buddhism went from being a intimate, humble religion in India, traveling slowly over centuries up into China, and then blew up into the biggest and most influential religion in East Asian history. Likewise, Christianity did the same thing in the Middle East and Europe, spanning all the way from Africa into Japan, into the Naban ports. Islam did the same thing. The caravans from Mecca and through Saudi Arabia and the Middle East were preaching the word of Allah and carrying the Quran. They specifically grew because of that access to trade. But then ultimately, the Silk Road's greatest invention, so to speak, was also its downfall. Technology like the compass led to the insignificance and irrelevance of the Silk Road, because as the maritime powers in Europe got to compass and started to perfect it because of the knowledge and ideas that they traded, they spurned a new age. And that age was the age of exploration. Suddenly, their big ships could finally go into the unknown, and they were able to discover things that the Silk Road could not get for them. They were able to go find new routes, and they ultimately went west, finding the Americas. With that, they gained access to new luxuries, new trade routes, and new civilizations. But unfortunately, this is the second trade network that has been the most influential, and it's the most upsetting because it is the transatlantic slave trade. Growing up, many students learned that it's the triangular trade, and they show you the nice map of, oh, goods went here and there and there. But that's a really soft way to explain a really, really dark piece of history and the dark side of trade. Over the course of 350 years or so, 12.5 million Africans were sent and enslaved from Africa into the Americas. It was the first example of industrialized genocide because we decided as humanity that slavery was okay because we're going to get cotton and tobacco and coffee and sugar, and it's going to be great. And I say genocide because not only did 12.5 million people get enslaved, but 1.8, almost 2 million of them died on the boats to America. And that was seen as an expense for these businesses, for these empires. And it's the first, it's not the first time, but it's the first time that the world really could see the scope of, what excess could do. And it's one of the reasons why trade is so significant, because none of the things that I've mentioned are essential for survival. Gold, silk, spices, cotton, sugar. These things are not essential for society and civilization to thrive, for humanity to exist, for humans to just live their lives. This is trade fueling this excess, fueling this comfortability that we have. And it's changed everything in our lives. We look, sound, smell, preach, pray differently because of trade. And that's why I believe it is the most significant aspect of human development. Our world would be completely different without it. Religions, technology, everything would be changed. And even the way that we live and die has changed because of the Silk Road, because of the transatlantic slave trade, because of these trade networks and these connections that trade has provided. And that's why I think it's the most significant aspect of human development. I hope that you can see that more clearly as well now too. If you don't, I'd love to hear your comments. Please engage me in discussion. I look forward to further conversation in the future. See you later.